Week, we did our pill bug lab, which involved testing to see what type of environments pill bugs prefer. I gave you a handout that looked like this. It provided a background information of the lab, as well as the question that we'll be trying to answer. The paper also lists the materials that we're going to need and the procedures we're going to follow. It even gives you a drawing of the apparatus we will use to test out our hypothesis, as well as a data display that we will keep our data on. Your job was to take all this information and transfer it into your lab journal using this format that I provided for you. This is the Laboratory Work and Reports Guide. The first three sections of this guide discuss the importance of keeping a lab journal as well as the requirements for said lab journal. The fourth section is a template that you are to follow when you are completing your labs in your lab journal. The template starts off with a title, followed by a problem or question that we are trying to answer. After a problem or question comes a hypothesis, which is your possible answer to that question. After hypothesis comes materials. Materials are to be listed in bullet fashion. After materials is procedure, which is a step-by-step guide to completing your experiment. After procedure comes the experimental design question section. This is where you will list any controls in your experiment, as well as identifying the independent and dependent variables. Under this section, you will also discuss the how and what type of data will be collected. After experimental design questions comes the data display. This is the section that you will keep your data on. So you must have a table for this section. After data display comes the analysis of results. This is a section where you will create a graph based off of the data collected. After analysis results comes conclusion. This is where you will write a summary of the entire experiment. After conclusion comes error analysis. This is the last section of your lab, and this is where you will discuss any issues that you may have had with the lab. If you look closely at each section, you will notice that there is a point value given. The point values are not equal for each section. The sections that contain information that I have given you and you have simply copied into your lab journal are not worth very many points. However, the sections that contain information that you had to develop and come up with on your own are worth quite a few points. For instance, if you look at data display, analysis of results, and conclusion, you will notice that these three sections alone account for 70% of the entire lab grade. This means that these sections are extra important, and you need to take your time and write well thought out information in these sections. Here is a student-generated example of the lab that we are performing this week, the pill bug lab. As you can see, this student listed the title, pill bug lab. Underneath title came problem/question, and then they listed the problem/question. Does moisture affect pill bug movement? Underneath the problem comes the hypothesis. They wrote out hypothesis and underlined it. Underneath that, they stated their hypothesis. Now I have blacked out their work so that you can do your own. After hypothesis comes materials. You can see that this student listed the materials in bullet fashion. You can use multiple columns if you like. Now the procedure that I gave you is in numbered format. You are to take that procedure numbered format and turn it into a paragraph form, which is what this student did. Included in the procedure is a drawing of any apparatus that we are using for our lab. This apparatus the student drew looks different than the apparatus we were using this week. You are to draw the apparatus that we were using this week and not this apparatus. After procedure comes the experimental design questions section. This is where you will write control and then identify it. You will also write independent and dependent variable and identify those as well. Lastly, you are to identify how and what type of data will be collected. After experimental design questions comes data display. This is where you took the table that I provided for you and simply copied it into the lab journal. Then on Friday, when we performed our experiment, you inputted all your data. So at this point, everything in your lab journal should be complete. You should probably now be working on analysis of results and conclusion. Analysis of results is where you draw a graph. This student's graph is a bar graph. The graph that I assigned you this week is a line graph. The sheet that I handed out to you describes what I want on the x-axis as well as what I want on the y-axis. On the x-axis for our lab this week is going to be the time, which is 2-minute intervals over a 20-minute period. On the y-axis will be the number of pill bugs. You are to have two different lines on this graph. One line for the wet chamber and another line for the dry chamber. After analysis of results comes the conclusion. This is a summary of all the lab. Now, this summary must be more than a few sentences long. This summary is to be well thought out and written. The final piece of your lab is the error analysis. This is where you write any issues that you may have encountered in our lab. If there were no issues, then you write out there were no issues encountered. Now, I want to go back to conclusion. On Thursday, I gave you a paper that looked like this. This paper describes the proper way to write a scientific explanation or conclusion. It lists the three components of a good conclusion. That is, a good conclusion makes some type of claim about the problem. This would be your hypothesis. Provides evidence for the claim. This would be the data you collected. And provides reasoning that links evidence to the claim. This is where you describe why you got the data you got. On the back of that sheet of paper, there is a table that looks like this. This is meant to be a guide. You are not to cut this out and paste this into your lab journal. This is the guide you use when you are coming up with your draft for your conclusion. This allows you to break up what is a large, daunting task into smaller pieces that are a little easier to manage. You start out by stating the question. Our question was, do pill bugs prefer wet environments over dry? Next, you figure out what your claim was. This is where you state your hypothesis. Our hypothesis was, because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they will prefer wet environments over dry environments. In the next section, this is where you list your evidence from data. You're going to put only what you see, not why you see it. So when we ran our experiment, our data showed that over the course of 20 minutes, the pill bugs began to migrate towards the wet chamber. After the 20-minute period, there were 70% more pill bugs on the wet chamber than on the dry chamber. In the science idea section, this is where we discuss the why of our data. Oftentimes, the background information on our write-ups can give us help with this. And so for the why of our lab, we're going to write, because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they must stay in moist environments in order to survive. This would account for the large number of pill bugs in the wet chamber versus the dry chamber. Now, this brings us to the final part, the explanation. This is where we link each section and come up with a good conclusion. First, I'm going to start by filling in my question. In this lab, we wanted to find out if pill bugs prefer wet environments over dry. Next, we link our claim, which is I believe that because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they will prefer wet environments over dry environments. Now we can link our evidence. Our test showed that over the course of 20 minutes, the pill bug began to migrate towards the wet chamber. After the 20-minute period, there were 70% more pill bugs on the wet chamber than on the dry chamber. And finally, we link our science ideas. Our data shows that because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they must stay in moist environments in order to survive. This would account for the large number of pill bugs in the wet chamber versus the dry chamber. Our final conclusion would read, in this lab, we wanted to find out if pill bugs prefer wet environments over dry environments. I believe that because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they will prefer wet environments over dry environments. Our test showed that over the course of 20 minutes, the pill bugs began to migrate towards the wet chamber. After the 20-minute period, there were 70% more pill bugs on the wet chamber than on the dry chamber. Our data shows that because pill bugs use gills to breathe, they must stay in moist environments in order to survive. This would account for the large number of pill bugs in the wet chamber versus the dry chamber. We now have a conclusion that will get us the maximum amount of points. We simply need to copy it and put it into our lab journals. With that, you now have all the information you need to write a successful lab journal. Good luck, and I look forward to reading your labs on Monday.